Briahna, you think that your colleagues at the Hill were actively conspiring against you?
Not all of them, but I do think that there was at best a mismanagement and a kind of obliviousness and ignorance of the situation, and at worst an effort to, set me up. As a news organization, represent yourself as being a credible conveyor of facts about the number one news story, not just in the country, but in the world, when you have quite literally fired one of your hosts, allegedly, well, who knows for what reason, but the reason that I think is because of her truthful, factual coverage of what's been going on in Israel. Again, I'm not contesting the firing. They have every right to fire me. My pushback is that they don't have a right to fire me and then pretend that they still are invested in these principles. There's free speech as a constitutional protection, right?
In the spirit
and then there's free
of
speech as a principle that they purported to uphold as a news organization.
Welcome back to the Don Lemon Show, everyone. Today, I am pleased to be joined by Briahna Joy Gray, a political commentator. She's the former National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders campaign, the 2020 presidential campaign. And notably, the reason we have her on to talk about this, she's a former co-host of The Hill's streaming show called Rising, which I watch a lot. And we'll talk about all of that. Briahna, there's so much to dig into, including, of course, your departure from The Hill. But first, tell me how you're doing. You've had I would say a week, but not even a week.
Yeah, I'm doing fine, in large part because this was a long time coming, and I'm sure we'll get into it. But, I wasn't told why I was let go, but there has been a feeling for quite some time that my coverage of Israel-Palestine in particular was rankling some folks, some higher ups at the company, and I've kind of been steeling myself against this eventuality for months now.
So you knew it was coming for some time. Why do you say that? And if you did, well, tell me why, and then I'll ask you the next question.
So there have been some pretty significant management changes over the past year, but about 6 months ago, pretty much the entire staff, from the sound and lighting crew to writers, script writers, to the producer of the show, have all either been fired or sort of pushed out because of the toxic environment that didn't relate directly to Israel-Palestine. But what ended up happening was that, to the extent that there were some sort of ideological allies or people who just were really good at their jobs and good at sort of writing for me and Robbie and our voices respectively on the show, those people were no longer around to have any kind of moderating a force against the message from top down, that people were unhappy with the Israel-Palestine coverage. There were specific instances that happened, like me being told that Norman Finkelstein, who is the preeminent scholar on the history of Gaza, I've got his book behind me on the shelf, was not going to be allowed to be a guest on the show, despite the fact that wherever he goes, he gets huge numbers and has an enormous expertise. And the reason given was because he's allegedly a Holocaust denier. Norman Finkelstein, both of his parents survived the Holocaust. He talks about that experience, that very personal experience with the Holocaust at length. And it was an unbelievable claim that seemed to be more about the fact that he is a very compelling Jewish advocate for Palestinian rights. So there were things like that. And there was direct pressure, not just on the kinds of segments that we covered, the number of segments that we did that were about that issue, but also on my radars, which had been held out to me as an inducement to do the show, in part because I had complete editorial freedom over it. But with the new producer, increasingly there were efforts to edit my radars in a way that, frankly, tone them down, and
let me explain
that I had to resist on a daily basis. Yeah,
what
please.
radars are. It's basically an editorial
sorry.
that you did to camera that was pre-produced, where you would give your take, mostly lately because you've honed in on Israel and Gaza, and you have been, very, I would say, a progressive voice and a voice that spoke out for Palestinians and what happened in Gaza. Now, and do you believe that that was the reason for your firing?
I do. I think that what I was told is that it came from the top. So in the defense of even my immediate production team, to the extent that there was conflict amongst us, the ultimate choice to fire me, to not continue my contract, does seem to have become from the very top of the company. That's all I was told. I don't know any more detail than that. But the tension around this particular issue has been longstanding.
Yeah. So you said if you knew it was coming for a long time, why then did you? Because I saw you leaning in more and more. And the last one, I have to tell you, to be honest with you, when I saw your last one, I was actually driving. I was on a long car ride, and I listened to the one that you did. I think it was the last, what you call radar that you did, where you criticized Bill Maher. I said, uh-oh, I think Brianna's going to be in trouble. Do you think?
I'm curious, why did you think that
Because
about that particular radar?
Well, I just thought that you went in, not to, I'm not judging anything that you did editorially, but I thought that you went in, and I thought that you were very pro Palestinian, and I could see how some might say that you were in ways making excuses for Hamas or siding with Hamas, or at least that would be the take that they may use as a pretext to get rid of you.
Well, it's interesting because that particular radar was about a segment that Bill Maher had did, in which he continued, I think, a long history. I don't think it's controversial to say that he's said a large number of Islamophobic statements over the years. These are not kind of fringe, open to interpretation statements. This is a. I mean, I don't want to misquote him. That's the only reason I'm hesitating, but things along the lines of, this is a bad religion, it's worse than others, it's a violent religion, these people are inherently violent, all of those kinds of things. So
It's
that,
kind of like Sam Harris, what Sam Harris does similarly.
right, exactly. So in that radar, I opened with the most recent statement that he's made of that nature, and talk about how fundamental that kind of perception of Arabs and Muslims in particular is fundamental to justifying the incredible disproportionality that we're seeing in Israel's assault on Gaza. So, I mean, to me, I don't think that one in particular was necessarily more, I don't know, inflammatory or controversial than any others, to say the basic truth about what it requires a country to do to a predominantly Arab population to maintain a Jewish demographic majority, which is, the whole point of Zionism, the state of Israel, is to create a state with a Jewish demographic majority. But to your earlier point, I have been doing radar specifically on Israel Palestine, precisely because it is one of the few ways I felt like I could get coverage of stories that otherwise I was not able to fight to get covered as straight news items. So, for instance, there was a day where I wanted to cover the controversy at the New York Times after they published their mass rape story that was later met with so much controversy even within the New York Times that its own podcast, The Daily, was unwilling to do the kind of usual complimentary podcast episode on a leading story because there were so many holes and factual inaccuracies. That report has now been debunked in numerous times by left-leaning magazines like Mondoweiss, The Gray Zone.
You said it's
The
now
Intercept.
or not been.
It has now been, yes.
Now been, yeah.
And most recently by the Times of London, that completely discredit all of the major sources that were used to spread the idea that there weren't just kind of discrete, and I don't mean to say just, but there weren't merely discrete incidences of sexual assault, but that there had been this mass rape campaign that happened on October 7th. When I wanted to report on the debunking of this story that was, again, reported out in mainstream news publications, there was so much resistance from my producer. I was told that once I went ahead and wrote the script, because again, we were understaffed, I was trying to be helpful, I went ahead and read the script for us to do as a news item, I was told, turn this into a radar. We can't do this as a straight news item. You have to make this into editorial content to put space between us and the news organization. And I would point out that any number of other controversial issues we talk about regularly on the show, whether they relate to COVID vaccines or trans issues and the like, never got that same kind of treatment. It wasn't about the level of controversy. I think it was specifically about sensitivities around Israel.
So before we get to the last interview that people say, in the moment that that folks say got you fired, at least that they use as a reason to fire you, if you knew that it was coming and if you knew they sort of had it out for you, why did you continue to do what you did?
Because the only reason that I chose to join Rising in the first place was because I feel like it's very important for a left perspective to have a voice in a relatively mainstream corporate news outlet. There are more never Trump Republicans that are allowed on ostensibly liberal channels like MSNBC and CNN than you'll ever see someone who's a Bernie supporter, who's left of center, who is willing to criticize the Democratic Party from the left. And I think what you're seeing right now with Biden struggling so horribly in the polls is the inconsequence of an administration that has insulated itself from left critique. That's not, by the way, not really left of center in the country. It's just left of the Democratic Party, which is frankly right on a number of economic populist issues and anti-war issues of the majority of the country. But because he's so insulated himself, and because the media basically has a blackout on what majorities of the countries think on that are outside of the Beltway, he is unable to be sufficiently responsive and is able to put his head in the sand and believe he can muscle his way through this election. So for me, an opportunity to bring those views to the fore that are more maligned in the country than even being a Republican on MSNBC or Republican on CNN was really important. And I should point out that one of my colleagues was fired over a year ago, who she was a correspondent with The Hill and came on regularly and spoke with us. She was being kind of vetted for potentially being a guest host, and they asked her to do one of these direct-to-camera radars. She did one on protests that were happening in Israel at the time. There was the Supreme Court stuff going on, and in her radar, she's a Jewish woman herself, described Israel as an apartheid. Right? Yeah, this is Katie Halper. She described Israel as an apartheid state and her contract was summarily terminated immediately after as well. So especially after that happened, I felt like it was incumbent on me to not shy away on this particular issue, because The Hill was making the argument that Katie's censorship was not ideological in nature. So I felt like I had to really test that hypothesis by not pulling any punches with respect to this issue, which is, of course, such an important issue, as the ICJ has described it as a plausible genocide, and over 35,000 people have been killed, 3/4 of whom are women and children.
Do you think, listen, the Hill, would you think it's fair to describe The Hill as a conservative outlet, right?
I know less. As a contract employee, I got to say, I was never as invested in learning that much about the inner workings of the company as my co-host.
But generally, it is seen as a right-leaning outfit. And
I think so. I mean, hesitation is really that my own ideological bias means that I think that most corporate news outlets are right-leaning. Is this one, right of center leaning? Depending on the management and the ownership, which has changed hands a couple of times over the last few years, I think that that's accurate.
Yeah, because I'm saying, considering the stance that you have, I'm just wondering if you had the sort of political leanings and the takes that you have on a right-leaning network, one may not be so surprised that they would try to get rid of you. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. So I think what you're trying to get at is, basically, did I ask for it? Yeah. And I think the answer would be, in some ways, yes. I'm not contesting them ending my contract.
Okay.
Right. But the question is, can an organization hold itself out as one that's invested in free speech, that's giving you fair, unbiased news coverage, when it would fire one of its most popular hosts for ideological reasons? And my show in particular, Rising in particular, is a show that, of course, is on a corporate news outlet, but which kind of postures like it's independent media, right? It's a streaming show. It can feel like you're watching one of these podcast style shows. We cover a lot of stories that are about media censorship, that are about the hypocrisy or inconsistencies of people who say that they care about free speech. And I think it's been revealed to be a kind of a stolen valor. It's a faux posturing as having commitments to these issues, which our audience, I think, sincerely very much does care about. So the question is whether The Hill, not me, but whether The Hill can continue to hold itself out, and Rising can continue to hold itself out as this really unique show in the space with a left chair and a right chair, once it has demonstrated a willingness to fire one of the chairs for ideological reasons.
Well, let me jump in, because I think that I liked watching the show, because of the free speech exchange, because of the sometimes tense nature of the show between you and, well, I forget Robbie's last name.
Suave.
Huh?
Suave, Robbie Suave.
Suave, like Rico Suave. So,
Exactly.
and I would not expect to see a show like that, quite frankly, on mainstream media because I think they would be too afraid, right, of corporate sponsors and, just of the backlash. But when you're on streaming, I mean, Briahna, it is kind of the wild, wild west, right? Whether you agree with someone's opinion or not, there are people who are really far one way and really far the other, and people who say things on a streaming platform that would be controversial and would warrant a firing in traditional media. Now, I'm not going to weigh in and say whether you should be fired or not, but I did like the nature of your show. So I was surprised actually that they fired you. First of all, I was surprised that The Hill actually did that they had you guys on there going at each other every day. I found that part refreshing. Not that I believed in everything that you said and not that I believed in everything Robbie said, but I thought it was a good exchange of ideas. And I like the uncomfortable nature of the conversation sometimes. But I have to ask you, because if you're arguing that it's free speech, right? But there are people who would say, especially if you believe in exactly what free speech means, and that is, the government can infringe or create no laws. They would say it's not actually a free speech issue because you can still speak in the town square, you can still speak out on Twitter, you're not being arrested for it, and the company doesn't have to pay you for your speech anymore. So I know you're not contesting your firing, but do you understand where I'm coming from with that? I do see your
Yeah,
side
but
where
I guess
it's
I'm
a
not.
streaming thing, but
I'm just a little confused because again, I'm not contesting the firing. They have every right to fire me. My pushback is that they don't have a right to fire me and then pretend that they still are invested in these principles. There's free speech as a constitutional protection, right?
in the
And then
spirit
there's
of,
free
of
speech
free
as a
speech.
principle that they
Yeah.
purported to uphold as a news organization. Also, outside of this free speech discourse, most news organizations only have any credibility because they are like committed to at least the veneer of a kind of ideological objectivity, right? Democracy dies in darkness. All of these slogans tend to allude to the idea of being a straight shooter and calling balls and strikes, even if we obviously know that MSNBC and CNN have a liberal bias and Fox News has a conservative bias. They all are committed to this idea of the truth. How can you, as a news organization, represent yourself as being a credible conveyor of facts about the number one news story, not just in the country, but in the world, when you have quite literally fired one of your hosts, allegedly, well, who knows for what reason, but the reason that I think is because of her truthful, factual coverage of what's been going on in Israel, Palestine. And I will point out, there's a clip going somewhat viral right now of me and my co-host arguing, in which I point out that the accusation that Hamas had beheaded 40 babies was a lie. It was discredited by both Israeli and American fact finders and journalists. But when my co-host insisted that it was true on air repeatedly for weeks, and I pushed back and things got very heated, there was never any consequences. And I'm not arguing that there should have been, but there were no professional consequences for him getting the facts so egregiously wrong or for raising his voice and yelling, and even at one point using the F word at me and calling me a simpleton on air. This was not about decorum. This was about ideology. And the viewers of The Hill are going to have to come to a decision about whether or not they can trust the news organization given their obvious ideological bias.
A couple of things. So you're saying there's a double standard between you and Robbie because he is more pro-Israel than you are?
I don't know if it's about me versus Robbie. I think it's about the issue. And I think that there is a bias against people who are critical of the actions of the Israeli state.
So had it been anybody sitting there who had your particular point of view, you think that they would have?
Yeah, I think so, as evidenced by the firing of Katie Halper.
Okay. So you're saying you're giving evidence that you believe is evidence that what Hamas did, what they're accusing Hamas of, was not right. There are people who will say she is a Hamas supporter, and that therefore there's no excuse for that. Anyone who supports Hamas in any way should not have a job or should not be able to speak those and have someone pay for you to say that.
I think the idea that reporting facts I'm sorry, I'm supposed to lie and pretend there were 40 beheaded babies, or else I support Hamas? Is that what journalism has come to? I think that you're pointing out something really important, which is that I think in most newsrooms, that is exactly what journalism has come to. We saw the three most prominent Arab Muslim journalists in the United States of America mysteriously disappear from the air in the days after October 7th. Mehdi Hassan no longer works at MSNBC, coincidentally, after October 7th. You've seen censorship happen across the board. And I would point out, it's not just that I've been let go from the Hill, which is fine for me. I mean, obviously there are financial implications and the like, but I have always run my life as though my sole income was my podcast, which is my primary source of income. Well, now I got hundreds and hundreds of emails sent, I think wrongly, to my my podcast email account addressed to Patreon, asking them to kick me off of my independent platform, my ability to support myself independently without the use of a network. This is how deep frankly, the bot campaign and the social media campaign that was recently reported on in the New York Times and other sources that is rooted in the Israeli government is willing to go to prevent people from saying basic true facts, like the 40 beheaded baby story was a lie, that the mass rape story about October 7th was a lie. And ultimately, it was my willingness to push back against this. This is not an opinion. This is clear, reportable facts. My willingness to push back against those lies in the context of an interview with a hostage's sister, which was supposed to be, and what I wanted to be, about talking about the human story of compassion and tragedy of being separated from a loved one and not knowing if they were safe and if they were going to be able to be brought home safely, into a political story where she raised a number of these political points that happened to be factually untrue. And when I pushed back against them, it became personalized, and I'm sure you'll want to get more into that.
Yeah, I do, because I feel like we kind of backed into this because we didn't talk about the interview that, was the last interview and that people believe it is what got you fired. But I think this is fine this way because then it'll be one of the last things that we do, and so it'll sort of stick in people's memories when they watch this entire thing. So I have to ask you, knowing what happened to Katie and considering what you said about Katie Halper and what you said about Mehdi Hassan, and that they were sensibly let go from the networks because of their stance on Israel and Gaza. I think Mehdi was let go because of his criticism of Netanyahu and the IDF. So did that give you any pause as to, what, I need to be careful about how I say this or how I do this? Or do you think that, I should be able to do this and, devil may care what happens because I'm supposed to be doing this? That's what a journalist does.
No, I didn't have any hesitation because my job isn't to massage empire. My job isn't to bolster empire. I don't know why anyone would become a journalist to simply become a stenographer for state power. I was a corporate lawyer, you have to understand. I didn't move into this space because of some financial incentives. I started freelancing because there were issues that I passionately cared about that I didn't think were being given appropriate voice to in the wake of the Bernie 2016 campaign. That career took off because there was an appetite for a voice like mine in a crowded corporate media space that was not allowing progressives to have any kind of a room. I was so glad to join Mehdi Hassan at The Intercept as a co-worker of his for about a year before being recruited by the Bernie Sanders campaign. But nothing about my career trajectory after leaving the law had anything to do with any kind of mercenary agenda. It was a matter of principle. So if I can't be in this space upholding the principles that I gave up 7 years of schooling to do, and a degree that I'm seeing lying on the ground here because I've yet to hang it up, then I don't see the purpose of doing this. And I think that if more people, frankly, had that level of integrity, we would be living in a political space that was much more representative of the American public's needs, instead of being in the midst of frankly a national presidential campaign with two historically unpopular candidates that frankly are emblematic of how ill-suited our political parties are to meet the needs of the country at this time.
So what are you saying? Because again, we don't hear these conversations, and we don't really, especially in the traditional media, right, in legacy media, you don't usually hear people going as far as you did in support, right? Maybe a commentator or two here. So what does that say about the folks who are on the air as journalists and the corporate structure that's kind of set up around that? Do you think it makes people afraid, it puts people in a position to be afraid to say how they really feel? Because quite frankly, when after the war started, people would call me from, other networks and say, Don, every time I get off the air, I'm worried that I'm going to be fired. I go over every single thing that I said because I think I'm going to be canceled, or I'm going to be fired, or I'm going to end up like Mehdi Hassan, even though that may not have been the intent of my words.
I think that's a fascinating sort of admission, Don. Like that's incredible. That's horrible. Have you ever, and let me ask, may I ask you this? In all of your years of broadcasting, has there ever been another issue where your colleagues, really at the top of the profession, have reached out to you expressing this level of concern that saying the wrong thing about this issue was going to lead to them literally being fired from their jobs?
No, I have not. And I don't know if it's because I'm no longer there and they felt more comfortable because I'm not in a position to be there. But also, I mean, Briahna, if you know anything about me, then, I'm uh, more on the outspoken side, and I'm usually the one that's sort of taking the slings and arrows up front. So maybe they were confiding in me because I'm the one who's usually the one who is in that position. And so they just wanted to use me as a sounding board. I have no idea. Is that a
Well,
fair
look,
answer?
I appreciate you saying that because I think a lot of people are reluctant to say that. I mean, I know my friend Crystal Ball, who previously co-hosted Rising and really innovated and founded the show before moving on to her new show, Breaking Points. She talked about being pushed out at MSNBC because of statements that were at all critical of Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016, critical from the left. There are, I think, issue areas, specifically when it comes to kind of electoral politics, where there are similar kinds of pressure. But I think that you raise a really important point. Yes, I knew I was likely to lose my job, and that was only a matter of time. I chose to take on that risk. I am lucky enough to have a independent, Patreon supported show where I know I can continue to pay my bills because of the support of my patrons. Other people aren't so lucky, and other people have other kinds of demands on them financially, and they toe the line because that is a really real threat. And we should talk about where that threat is coming from. Was reporting just last week about the fact that the Israeli government has a specific department that is geared toward creating a social media environment specifically targeting U.S. lawmakers, and specifically in targeting Black U.S. lawmakers, to make it so that they are less likely to be critical of Israel and to boost them for any pro-Israel statements. Now, we just spent what seems like a decade almost talking about Russian interference in U.S. elections, whether or not Cambridge Analytica was a determining factor in 2016, foreign influence campaigns, and all the rest. But there has been barely any attention paid to a well-reported story about the Israeli government very intentionally trying to do exactly what there was a lot of insinuation about Russia doing back in 2016 and 2020. And it's worth asking why that is. Is it fear, again, that these kind of campaigns are effective at getting people canceled, effective at getting people fired, that prevents reporters from even really talking about the extent to which they are being manipulated by not some abstract force, and certainly not, and I know this is going to be the accusation, some Jewish cabal or anything anti-Semitic like that, but a literal department of the Israeli government, which does not represent all Jewish people, does not represent Jewish Americans. It is an autonomous state, the Israeli government seeking to influence U.S. politics and U.S. politicians in particular.
Well, I do think that there's a concern. I think the concern this time, Briahna, was that what happened on October 7th was so horrific. And, in the moment, maybe there were people, the sentiment in the country, and maybe with the powers that be, that now is not the time to be critical of Israel, considering what had happened, considering the horrific nature of what happened on October 7th. The further we get away from that, it's okay, but I'm not sure. I'm trying to understand what is happening and why this is so different. Maybe that was the sentiment. I don't know.
Well, look, I think that it was a much more credible argument on October 10th, October 20th, about whether or not this was the time. And certainly time should have been taken and was taken to mourn the loss of innocent Israeli life on October 7th and to continue to worry about the fate of hostages that, again, are being, I think, when you compare the level of care that they're getting compared to what the pictures look like of Palestinian hostages that are being released from Israel and hostage exchange programs and the like, it's frankly galling that given the embargo on food and medicine and clean water, that the Israeli hostages are coming back looking somehow healthier than the hostages that have been kept, Palestinian hostages in Israel, who have every medical convenience and benefit in the world in terms of food and care. But that being said, of course, they are under terrible conditions in Gaza because all Gazans are under terrible conditions with the failure to bring aid, Israelis blocking aid, both Israeli civilians and the Israeli government blocking aid. Of course, I'm sure you covered at length the horrific targeted drone attack of the central kitchen, the Jose Andres workers that killed one American. An American was also killed, an American hostage with, I think, joint citizenship was killed in this most recent hostage rescue mission from a few days ago that also killed 274 Palestinians. So the question is, all these months later, if you do really genuinely believe that the loss of innocent Israeli life on October 7th was horrible and horrific, what then do you say to the fact that we've had exponentially more civilian life lost in Palestine? That is also horrific. And because
it is war, though, Briahna. I don't think it's going to be. You're not going to have the same number of people killed on both sides. And what Israel would say is that we're fighting for our existence.
How is that?
Because they believe that Hamas, and I think rightfully so in many ways, does not want them to exist. And so whatever they have to do to get Hamas, they will tell you that they have to do it. And I mean, it's awful that innocent people are dying, but if Hamas was not doing what Hamas did, and especially on October 7th, then they wouldn't be in a position to have to do that.
So then I know that you recently had an interview with Bassem Youssef, and he explained this to you much better than I can, that to the extent that Hamas is the ruling leadership in Gaza, it is specifically because Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party made it so, funded it, wanted it to be the case, so Israel could always have this argument that there was a more radical, extreme politics in the area that couldn't be negotiated with, could only be murdered and killed. And you see the hypocrisy of that stance when after the ICC warrants were issued, or right before the ICC warrants were issued for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu for war crimes and Yoav Gallant, cabinet member, he didn't threaten Hamas. He threatened the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which is supposed to be the secular, understood, reasonable leadership of Palestine, because that is what really presents him to be with a threat. What does it mean when it becomes quite obvious that, frankly, the Likud party is much more right-wing than the secular Palestinian Authority? And of course, he followed through on those threats, and there were a number of people killed in the West Bank immediately after the ICC warrants were issued. So this really isn't about Hamas. You have to ask what Hamas's mission is and why they exist in the first place. Israel has an obligation to the people of Gaza as an occupied territory under international law. If it does not want to have that obligation to the people of Gaza to make sure they're provided with food and water and basic humanitarian supplies, it could simply stop keeping them in the state of limbo that they've been in for the past 75 years and allow them to have an autonomous country. The problem is that we have repeatedly the U.S. and Israel blocking a two-state solution in the United Nations and also opposing a one-state solution precisely because Israel wants to maintain a demographic Jewish majority in the state and therefore imposes apartheid conditions on the 5 million Palestinians that live in the West Bank and Gaza in violation of international law.
Yeah. So you mentioned Bassem. Bassem believes that it's genocide and apartheid, and I think that Mehdi says the same thing. And I'm curious because I'm going to ask you the same question that I asked Mehdi. What do you say to people who don't like Benjamin Netanyahu? They understand, as you said, that that he has in some ways helped to prop up Hamas. And they don't like him. They don't really like what the IDF They think it's been responsible for the way the IDF has carried out this war on Gaza. They are in favor of a ceasefire, but they may flinch at those words, a genocide or apartheid, like in similar terms. Do you think that you are, and people like Bassem or Mehdi, that you're at risk of alienating potential allies from using such inflammatory language?
Well, let me ask you this. Well, let me say this. For one, I personally choose to always say that what the ICJ has plausibly described as genocide, because that's the judgment that's been made so far. That there was a preliminary assessment as to whether or not South Africa's case should go forward. It looked to see whether there was basically a legitimate claim here and said, yes, this is plausibly genocide, the case can go forward. I also am leaning on humanitarian law experts, people like Craig Mokhiber, people like Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, who talk about how, although in most cases it's difficult to prove genocide because there is this intent element, because the Israeli government and so many of its senior officials have been so explicit about its plans for Gaza that frankly it's an open and shut case. So when you have
Well, she says, the rapporteur says, she says it's the definition of genocide.
Right. So when you have people saying things like, we're going to cut off all food and aid to Gaza to starve the civilian population, I mean, that's quite literally a war crime. That's quite literally collective punishment. That's quite literally genocide, right? So I personally believe it's genocide, but for the reason that you described, alienating people and whatnot, I do personally choose to say what the ICJ has plausibly described as genocide. Apartheid is different. Apartheid is a consensus of a large number of international aid organizations, including Israel-based international or humanitarian organizations like Bet Selem. There really actually is no ambiguity about the definition of apartheid and the two-tiered system of treatment within Israel for Arabs and Jewish Israelis, and of course people who don't have Israeli citizenship and people who do. So again, to the extent that there are people who are offended by that, I would create an analogy for you. You and I both know that when we're talking about difficult issues surrounding race and racism, there are people who don't want you to say that anything is racist, no matter how explicit the racism is. There are people who would deny the reality of any inequality that exists in the United States of America and perhaps even the world. Do you modulate your language when you're trying to talk to people like that? Maybe in some cases you do. Maybe you use a term like prejudice. Maybe you use a term like identitarian, depending on what the crowd is. But at core is whether or not you believe that there is this rank injustice going on. And what I think is that people aren't actually objecting to the terms apartheid and genocide. What they're objecting to is the notion that, frankly, Israel and Israelis could be the substantive bad actor in this equation because of the choice to perpetuate an occupation on this population for 75 years, to perpetuate ethnic cleansing, and to now be engaging in a bombing campaign and a military campaign where children are being shot in the head by snipers. These are not accidental killings, where Israel killed 3 of its own hostages at the end of last year with very little fanfare, where humanitarian aid organizations like the Jose Andres workers are being targeted and killed, and where just this past week, it's been reported that there is a torture camp, an Israeli torture camp, where they're literally sodomizing with metal rods Palestinian prisoners, and that's not getting the same amount of coverage as a debunked 40 beheaded baby story or the mass rape story.
I know what the answer would be from people, and listen, because I'm asking these questions, or because I'm, positing certain things, it doesn't mean that it's my belief. As you know, that's a job as a journalist. So there were people who are supporters of Israel, and they would say, well, that if you don't want that to happen, then don't do October 7th. And then the other answer will be, well, this didn't start on October 7th. It started well before, as you said, 75 years of occupation. So then, I don't know. What do you say to that? Because I just don't know if there is, I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah,
Because,
that's a good question. And my last radar that you alluded to, the Bill Maher one, I think really gets to the core of this. Look, for reasons that I have a lot of empathy for, as someone who is horrified whenever I reflect on the Holocaust, as someone who comes from a historically marginalized group, and I think viscerally understands the fear of what it means to live in a country where the predominant population is not like you and has a history of targeting you with the law and marginalizing you legally. I understand why there was a desire to have a Jewish state and why the international community supported that effort in the wake of World War II. I really do get it from kind of a psychological and emotional and frankly even a historical perspective. But the reality is that the international community's interests weren't in protecting the safety of Jewish people. It was in protecting themselves and their own populations that were also deeply anti-Semitic despite having just fought World War II at the time, and who did not want those Jewish refugees to come to their countries as well. And so the Palestinians were asked to bear the brunt of European racism. And were told that they had to deal with an ethnic cleansing campaign, literally being kicked out of their homes, having their olive trees that they've been tended for hundreds and thousands of years burned down or dug up, and sent to live as permanent refugees in a stateless land for the better part of a century. And I do think that there is a world, I mean, there's something that I've noticed happening with pro-Israel interlocutors, and they will argue simultaneously that Israel is a democracy that we should be defending because, in part, look at how peacefully the 20% Arab population is able to live within Israel. You know, what other state could claim the same? But I would say the flip side of that is, then why won't you accept a one-state solution in which all of the Arabs that have been kept in limbo are allowed to also peacefully live next to you? And then suddenly you get all these arguments about how inherently venal and violent and barbaric the population is, and how it would be a quote unquote bloodbath. That's what someone called it in a debate recently with me about a month ago. And so I think people have to reconcile with this. Do you actually believe that Muslims, that Arabs are unsuitable to live next to? Do you kind of reflect the ethos that made Donald Trump's Muslim ban so distasteful to so many folks back in 2016? Or do you take the first part of Israel's argument that, of course, Arabs and Jews and Christian Arabs as well have been living side by side in the region for millennia, and that the real problem here is a supremacist ideology that wants to privilege one religious group rights over the others in the state of Israel? Does it, to have a Jewish state, are we just confronted with the reality that it requires there to be a hierarchy that is based on religion in a way that I think as Americans we find to be deeply distasteful?
If they would say it is if the majority of those people, if it is sort of an edict, right, with either within their religious teachings or in a doctrine somewhere that they don't believe that the Jewish state should exist, then therefore that would be their argument.
Yeah, I mean, so let's disaggregate that a little bit. If I asked you, do you think the American apartheid state, the segregated America, deserved to exist? I suspect you would say no. Now, that doesn't mean America stops existing, right? It means that we have a revolution of sorts, whether it's the Civil War or a civil rights movement, that gets us closer to substantive equality. And we no longer have an American apartheid state. It ceases to exist. We now have America. Same with South Africa. Did the South African apartheid state have a right to exist? I would say no, absolutely not. And now it doesn't. But South Africa still exists as a more pluralistic, equal society. And there was a time, of course, that the Hamas Charter was deeply, specifically virulently anti-Semitic. They seem to have had some self-awareness and revised their charter some years ago to remove that and to be more clear that what they want is the end of a Jewish state that is not the end of like a kind of a mass genocide of Jewish people or Israelis, which of course is unconscionable and should be guarded against at every turn. But the question, when people are often talking about does Israel have a right to exist, it sidesteps the question of whether or not Israel has a right to exist in its current form as an apartheid state that oversees an occupied population that has been oppressed for 75 years. And when framed that way, I think a lot of people would say, well, I guess no, I don't think that version of Israel, you know, whether or not it has a right to exist, it should not be supported militarily into the tune of over $3 billion every year by the U.S. government.
Briahna, let's get to the reason that you believe that you were fired besides all the stuff leading up to it, this is your interview with a sister of a Jewish hostage. Her name is Yarden Gonen. You were interviewing her, and then at the end, you rolled your eyes. Let's watch.
I really do hope that Netanyahu agrees and Israel agrees to the ceasefire deal that could bring all the hostages, including your sister, home. And I'm sure many people watching are praying for her safety.
Thank you. Me too. And I really hope that you specifically will believe women when they say that they got hurt.
All right. Thanks for joining. Stick around. More Rising coming up next.
Okay, so you rolled your eyes at the end, and what people are saying is that you did that. What you were doing was rolling your eyes and somehow shaking off or making light of rape victims and a sister's a hostage to a sister to a hostage.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that there is no, in this context of this conversation, no rape victim. Of course, we don't know what has happened to her sister in custody. She is still a hostage. There was one reported documented instance of a hostage alleging that she was sexually assaulted. She didn't describe the details of that. It's not clear that it was rape, but definitely sexual assault. So there's no need to kind of quibble with that reporting. That seems well substantiated.
She's saying believe all victims. She said, you as a woman, I would hope would believe all victims.
Right. And that is the victim that has been clearly identified.
Or believe women, she said.
Yeah, that is that one victim is the one that the who has been reported out as having been the victim of sexual assault, not Yarden's sister, and notably not these other women who the New York Times is now kind of shrouded in disgrace for having misreported in its infamous mass rape screams without words story from last December. So my frustration was that this is an interview that I think rightly should be done to emphasize the kind of human personal story of what people are going through, family members are going through, of folks who are hostages. But what ended up happening during the course of the interview was that when we were asking her questions about her sister and what she had been hearing from the Israeli government and how she felt about efforts to get hostages released, whether she supported Benjamin Netanyahu prioritizing the goal of quote unquote eliminating Hamas over the ceasefire and hostage exchange deals, which she has repeatedly shot down over the last months, how she's feeling about all of that. Because as we know, there have been protests by hostage families precisely because the perception among many in Israel is that Benjamin Netanyahu is not in fact prioritizing the hostage deal, that he in fact wants the war to keep going because his own political longevity is contingent on the war going on.
If Hamas let the hostages go, that there would be a ceasefire? You don't think that he would stop?
He has specifically said that he would not.
Yeah.
That's not ambiguous. That's not up in the air. So when she then would bring up these political issues, right? She started by alluding to the idea that there was going to be another 9/11 in Michigan, presumably implying that our American brothers and sisters in Dearborn, Michigan, which has the largest Muslim population in America, were somehow a threat to us. I found that to be offensive. I corrected it and we moved ahead. She started raising
Let me play that part because that's the longer version of the clip that people aren't playing. Let's play that and then I'll let you talk about it on the other side.
I really see that you want to talk political things, and this is not my profession. I'm saying right now that we have an Israeli deal on the table, and we're waiting for Hamas to say yes.
Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case. I wish that it were, but unfortunately, that does not seem to be the case. Would you like to say anything else that we should know about your...
That even Biden said himself. This is what the Egyptian government said. This is what the Qatari said just today. And this is what my government said. Hamas also said that they're waiting, they need to read the agreement and to decide whatever they want. I don't know, but what I'm getting is from the media, and I'm sure that you're getting it from the media yourself because you're not in the negotiation team. So I'm here to talk about my sister. Please help me spread her story. Help me make people understand what she's going through as a woman in 2024. We are not 200 years ago. This is not okay that we have terror organization that's controlling the free world and people in the West letting it happen and stay on the streets. killing the hostages now, or Israelis must die. What did I do wrong? What did my sister did wrong? Nothing. Nothing. We did nothing wrong.
Well,
This
we
was
are
happening inside our own country.
Yeah.
And if the world won't help us, we will see 9/11 the second time in the US as well. Because we can already see in the United States, in Michigan, rallies that calling death to America, not condemning terror organizations in Israel or any other place, in fact, is reflecting to your country as well.
I'm just going to push
So
back
it's
against
not-
the implication that in Michigan, which has the largest Muslim and Arab population in America, that there is any threat of terrorism from our own people. And I would like to clarify also that one of the rationale that was presented for 9/11 was discussed with America's support of Israel's continued occupation of Palestine. So that's neither here nor there. I really do hope that Netanyahu agrees and Israel agrees to the ceasefire deal that could bring all the hostages, including your sister, home. And I'm sure many people watching are praying for her safety.
Thank you, me too. And I really hope that you specifically will believe women when they say that they got hurt.
All right,
Because I've
thanks
heard
for
a lot of
joining.
things that you said.
Stick around. More Rising coming up next.
Okay.
Sure.
So
And there was another moment where she also alluded to specifically allegations of rape on October 7th that had been reported by this ultra-religious organization called Zaka, who had the most discredited allegations of rape from October 7th that have been discredited not just by mainstream media sources, including, I believe, the Times, who had to walk back its own reporting, but also by the UN, investigators are a strong word, but the UN official that was sent to look into this, Pramila Patten, whose report specifically disproved a number of those all of those Zaka allegations of rape, finding rank inconsistencies, and basically said that those were all a lie. So as a journalist, again, when she brought those issues up, I had to say, I have to correct the record. Those have been disproven. At that point, she seemed a little bit irritated with me and started to personalize the conversation. So you'll hear her say, you specifically, Briahna, I need you to believe women. Now, that's not really the issue at hand. I think her frustration was that I did not believe the specific accounts of the ultra-Orthodox men in the Zaka group who alleged that rapes had taken place, which I think it's a good thing that they didn't actually take place.
let me ask you something, Briahna.
Yeah, please.
Because, look, I've been doing this for a long time, and I don't always get it right. And we talked about timing. You could have corrected that after she left. You could have said, thank you for joining us. Now, I do want to turn to Robbie and say, Robbie, I do want to say that there was some, factually she got something wrong, but I did not want to disrespect the sister of a hostage.
Oh, well, that's not how the show works. We couldn't have done that. We wrap when the guest wraps. There was no way for me to communicate to the control room that I wanted to keep the show going. That's never how we
No, but
run
at the
a
end of it,
segment
you said,
before.
we'll be back with more Rising. I think that you could have said, thank you for joining us, and then you could have clarified after the guest left.
That would have, I'm just telling you factually, that would have caused confusion and disarray in the control room, and they would have cut off the whole segment without me having an opportunity to say whatever I was.
All right,
going
I'm
to
not
say.
there, so thank you for clarifying that. So let's just be clear here and direct. You were not rolling your eyes. Were you rolling your eyes at, and were you dismissing her as the sister of a hostage?
Of course not. Let me tell you what happened. When this guest was proposed, the producer, who again has been very antagonistic to covering this particular issue, specifically told me that this hostage sister wanted to come to talk to me. She didn't say there's someone who wants to come on the show and be interviewed by you and Robbie. She specifically said she wanted to come talk to me. And I kept the screen grab of that exchange so I could cite the language precisely and not forget it. And to me, this was a signal that this was going to be someone who personally disagreed with me on this issue, which is fine, but was going to use the opportunity on the show to try to litigate my reporting on things like the mass rape hoax, instead of talking about what I think is the pressing issue of the time, which is the safety of hostages like her sister. And so at the end of the interview, I pushed back against my producer. I said, I have never said no to an interview, but I know what's going to happen here. And I expect you to basically have some interest in also protecting me as the talent from people who have come on the show, basically used it as an opportunity to sling personal attacks at me, clipped those clips and tried to go viral off of it, and basically be part of a Hasbara campaign that may or may not be funded by, as I alluded to before this story, this mass effort from the Israeli government to push a certain kind of narrative on social media. And I said, I don't want to be exploited like that again, but I do think it's important to listen to the family of a hostage victim.
Why did you participate then?
Moreover, I'm getting to that part. The night before we, go on air, a email is circulated with the lineup of who's going to be on the show that day and what the agenda is for the show. The night before this episode, I was not on the email. And I was additionally not on the morning version of the email that gets circulated in the AM. Was this an accident? Was it intentional? Who can know? Because I am no longer in contact with anybody at the Hill. But the reality is I did not realize that this guest was going to even be on the show until moments before we recorded. So I'm not saying I would have objected to it, but I do think that there might have been a conversation I had with Robbie about how we were going to best handle it and things like that. And none of that was able to transpire. So my exasperation at the end of the interview was feeling like, frankly, this was a setup and that my producer ignored my really well-expressed concerns about what could happen here, did nothing to try to intervene and make it a more conducive environment for this kind of an interview. And I think that my concerns were validated when we now see what the outcome is. I was very frustrated with my producer. We had a very tense conversation afterward where I admonished her, frankly, for falling into this kind of trap. And instead of seeking out guests to come on the show, as you would expect from a news organization, basically taking solicitations from folks who may or may not be bad faith actors, when there are plenty of hostage victims. I have one online that I plan to talk to on my own podcast, Bad Faith, in the coming week or so, who have, I think less of a personal agenda or a personal vendetta to attack me for quote unquote not believing women simply because I've done my job as a journalist to debunk incorrect stories about what happened on October 7th.
Okay, so Briahna, you think that your colleagues at the Hill were actively conspiring against you?
Not all of them, but I do think that there was at best a mismanagement and a kind of obliviousness and ignorance of the situation, and at worst an effort to set me up.
Do you regret do you regret the way you handled it? Would you have done anything differently?
I don't think I did anything wrong, no, but I do regret obviously giving people a pretext for firing me. It should also be noted that this was the second campaign by the same actors within about 10 days, a week or so, to try to generate internet controversy around some statements of mine that could get me fired. So about a month before, I had done a debate at this conference called Due Dissidence. And again, remember when I was talking about the story about U.S. Congress members being influenced by the Israeli government very explicitly. This is not a conspiracy. This has been reported out in mainstream news outlets. Richie Torres, a Congress member from New York, took that clip, circulated it around, and went through the same, when you're experiencing a kind of a bot pile-on, the same actors tried to make that clip.
You think I don't know?
A fireable offense. You're familiar with it.
Yeah, and I'm very familiar with everything you're talking about.
The exact same pattern with Richie Torres, who did this all from behind the block, so I wasn't even aware of it at first, but circulated the eye-rolling clip with this clear goal to have what happened to actually happen. And so if it wasn't this, it was going to be something else, right?
So you don't regret the eye roll? You regret that they used it as a pretext?
I regret it insofar that it became a pretext for firing me, and it allowed people who want to argue that this wasn't about ideological censorship to say that is why. But I want to be really clear. I mean, I presume I can't curse on this program.
Yeah,
I can't say to you the things that have been said to me on The Hill Rising, both by my co-host and by guests that have come on the show and attacked me very personally.
On the show while that aired?
Yes, absolutely.
Like what?
So one of the ringleaders of I'm reluctant to say his name just because I don't want to give him any more attention, but one of the ringleaders of the push to get me fired was once a guest on the show. Again, there was this interest in having more pro-Zionist guests, and I appreciate that. But instead of finding people who I've had on my own podcast, like a scholar of the history of Zionism from Dartmouth University, for example, is someone I've had on. They have, internet people who have a long history of simply just fighting. And this is so petty. I hate to even have to talk about this, but just have a long history of kind of nipping at my heels and my mentions, who solicit themselves to the Hill as guests. And the Hill seems to think it's appropriate to bring someone on who has, been calling me Jew hater and every other name in the book, as though that's going to be a reasonable guest who can respect the decorum of the show. And so then they're making personal attacks. They're accusing me of not believing women because I've simply done my job as a reporter. And the obligation is on me to never defend myself in an institution that I know also has no interest in defending me or protecting me in any way. So like I said, it was only a matter of time. If it wasn't this, there was going to be some exchange a week or 2 or 3 from now that was going to justify them letting me go, because fundamentally the months of pressure that I've experienced at the Hill made it clear to me that the fundamental problem was that I was willing to say true facts about what was going on in Israel, Palestine.
I'm surprised, quite frankly, that you're out here and you're able to say everything that you're saying, because if you had worked for, I think a more traditional outlet, and not to disparage the Hill, but a bigger outlet, I think there would have been.
Well, no, it's not an accident. They wanted me to have an employment contract where I would have been barred from saying some of this stuff. I take your point.
Oh, okay.
I take your point, but I resisted. And there are consequences for me, right, as well, right? I'm not being paid out in some big lump sum. They don't have to pay me into my contract. I'm losing out on money, but it was important to me to not have those restraints on me, especially after Katie Halper was fired.
Well, good for you.
Because I think it's important to be able to tell the truth about what these news organizations are really like.
That's very admirable of you. Now, let me ask you this, considering everything that you just said, and it may seem strange, but I just have to ask you, you said to believe women, are you a misogynist in any way? You can be a woman and be misogynist.
Of course you can. I mean, long before October 7th, I think I have felt that those kinds of slogans are somewhat reductive, right? I think it's absolutely true that women are disproportionately not believed, both in the court of law and in the court of public opinion, that for centuries and generations of women who have experienced sexual assault, the odds are so stacked against them that they will be believed, that it's understandable why a kind of slogan like that would emerge to remind people to give women the benefit of the doubt. And from that perspective, I think that that's right and good. But to the extent that you take it very, very literally to mean that there is never any instance in which anybody ever lies about sexual assault. Now, it's very, very rare. I want to really emphasize this. It's incredibly rare because of the stigma around even reporting sexual assault as a victim, right?
But it does happen. I know
but it does, of course, happen. So, and when we're talking in the context of October 7th, again, where these now debunked claims of mass rape were used to justify a wildly disproportionate response on a civilian population that has killed tens of thousands of children and women and innocents. And we're seeing videos every day of babies with their brains literally leaking out of their heads and fathers collecting the small little limbs of their loved ones to collect in a bag for burial. When we're seeing mass graves being uncovered in Gaza, and when we're seeing that the IDF has dug up 16 cemeteries as though Hamas is under the gravestones, when we've seen every university in Gaza demolished, at a certain point, you have to understand that there was a direct relationship between our willingness to believe how barbaric and craven and horrible Palestinians must be to have raped all of these women on October 7th, and our willingness to allow that genocide, that plausible genocide, that bombing campaign that has killed over 35,000 people to take place. And so, no, in this context, I'm not going to allow legitimate claims, like legitimate concerns about women who have been raped and aren't believed, to be used to justify the murder of so many women in Gaza, and of course, children and innocent men as well.
Are you, in your words, I could say anti-Semitic, are you a Jew hater?
Of course not.
Okay. Do you support Hamas?
No. I do think it's an interesting question. I also do not support the state of Israel. It's not my job to support a group or another. I'm a journalist.
Are you a Hamas sympathizer?
I'm sympathetic with the Palestinian people who are under occupation and who have a right under international law to armed resistance.
People compared your firing to Candace Owens' departure from the Daily Wire. She had some harsh criticism of Israel. So do you think that there are similarities? Any similarities there?
100%. I actually just spoke to her earlier today.
Are you going to talk to her? You spoke to her on her program?
Yes,
You
it's
did?
pre-recorded, so I don't know when it'll
Okay.
be out. But
So that'll be out.
yes, I just spoke to her literally about an hour before I sat down with you. So
And
I
what did
think
you
there
think?
are.
How did that go?
I think about well. Obviously we disagree about a wide range of issues. There's frankly very little we do agree on, but I think it's undeniable that she was, fired from her media organization because of taking what I think is a principled stance on Palestine. I mean, she is not someone, I think, you listen to her say it in her own words. I don't want to mischaracterize her, but she was very clear that she's kind of coming to this issue sort of fresh. She's not taking sides here, but she knows kind of foundationally and fundamentally in her soul, especially as a mother, that killing children is wrong. And there's no excuse for killing children. And of course, what is the number now? 14,000 children have been killed in Gaza. It's a population.
Those numbers have been disputed, though, right? All of them, even the 35,000 killed.
It is disputed because it's likely to be much higher. The 35,000 number has been stagnated for months because all of the people who were organizationally able to count the dead in Gaza have been killed, with every single hospital in Gaza having been bombed and the medical infrastructure absolutely destroyed. Yeah. So what she feels in her heart is that the images, we don't have to count to see, again, the flood of images every single day. Just in the rescue mission alone, a few days ago, there were, a dozen or so kids killed, and we don't have to count on quote unquote Hamas numbers. We can see them. We can see them with literally, did you not see the graphic image of the father carrying the young child with literally his brains falling out of his head? He thinks he's dead. The child moves and he runs to a hospital to try to save his life. I mean, these are not abstractions. And I think some of the passions on the internet and the frustration is that you have these reporters in these clinical news environments completely ignoring what the whole world can see on the internet and on TikTok and reported by other international news organizations that don't have as much pro-Israeli bias.
Yeah.
So back to Candace Owens, just the only point was that she feels like whatever you think about this situation, there's no excuse to be killing children. And for taking that stance, which frankly should be pretty uncontroversial, she has been called everything but a child of God and asked to leave her news organization.
Do you ever think that you and Candace Owens would have this sort of connection where you're kind of agreeing with each other on a subject? And
Look, my political career over the last couple of years, and even before that, as part of the Bernie campaign, where we talked to a lot of people who had voted different ways, Obama to Trump to Bernie voters, people all over the ideological spectrum. I'm not unfamiliar with having simpatico with folks who I have also a lot of disagreement with. My whole point of the show with Robbie, we debated a lot of stuff, but we also were able to agree. He, as a libertarian, often felt the same way as I did about foreign wars, him more from a spending perspective, me from both a spending and a moral and ethical perspective. But nonetheless, we found ourselves very aligned in many of our criticisms of the two-party establishment. We are critical of the way that they shut out third parties. We support ranked choice voting. I mean, there are a lot of areas where Robbie and he's a libertarian, so he was less interested in kind of oppressing people's right to freely associate, gay marriage, trans issues, those kinds of things. There was less debate. Trans issues was more debate there, but there was less debate on those kinds of issues because he is kind of like socially, libertarian. So no, I'm not that surprised.
Okay. Well, listen, I liked watching the show because I thought it was, I really did like the back and forth. I loved the tension, and it takes mature people to be able to sit there and to hash out these conversations and to not take it personally. It doesn't happen in every environment. It doesn't happen, especially in, I have to say, it hasn't happened in many of the environments I worked in. I wanted to create that sort of environment, but I don't know if people are open to that. I have to ask you, though. So I think it's a real loss for the Hill. Again, not that I agreed with everything that you said, and not that I agreed with everything that Robbie said, but I thought it was a great program to tune into. That was, different than the sort of yell fests that can happen, even on, like a Piers Morgan, or you know what I'm saying, on programs.
Yeah, I know
like
what you're
that.
saying.
So then what is next for Briahna Joy Gray?
Well, I'm looking forward to being able to spend more time on my own podcast, which frankly has been a little neglected with all the time that I've had to spend on Rising. So people can continue to listen to me on Bad Faith podcast. I don't mean to toot my own horn, but what have been described as some of the best long form interviews that exist in the space, talking to people across the ideological spectrum on my own show, and also being a real staunch critic of the two-party system in a way that I think is really important in this coming election year. I also plan to try to integrate some of the formatting of Rising into my own show because I am going to miss doing more daily news coverage. So people should stick around for that. You can find the podcast wherever you get your podcast. It's called Bad Faith. You can also watch it in video format on YouTube. And if you want a second episode every week, I drop premium episodes on Mondays, and you can find that at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast, at least until the pro-Israel trolls email Patreon enough times to convince them to dump me from the platform.
So make sure you like and subscribe.
Yes.
Listen, one of the reasons I like being in this space is that I've been speaking to you for an hour, and I couldn't do that, elsewhere, and you probably couldn't on Rising, and now you'll have the opportunity to do so if you want to. So, if you so choose to do so. So, thank you, Briahna Joy Gray. I appreciate you joining. I hope you would come back, and I really do wish you the best of luck.
Anytime. Thank you, Don. I really appreciate the invitation.
Thank you. Thanks for watching The Don Lemon Show. Make sure you click on the image in the top right to subscribe to my channel and the thumbnail in the bottom right to watch more content from my show. And I'll see you next time.